media companies in response to a Republican lawsuit which accused the Biden administration of putting pressure on tech companies to suppress unfavorable viewpoints. Yesterday's ruling could upend years of efforts to improve coordination between the government and tech giants, particularly during elections and emergencies. As Democrats reel from another painful set of defeats at the Supreme Court in recent weeks, President Biden is facing renewed pressure from a range of elements in the Democratic Party, from liberal lawmakers to abortion rights activists, to more forcefully embrace far-reaching changes to the Supreme Court. 5 people were killed and 2 children were wounded in Philadelphia over the holiday. The man suspected of the shooting, who is in custody, appeared to be firing at random. The 5 killed were all males and ranged in ages from 15 to 59. The 2 wounded children, ages 2 and 13, were in stable condition. Now, there were shootings pretty much all over the country, including a mass shooting that occurred in Baltimore, Maryland. Ketanji Brown Jackson completed her rookie term as the first Black woman to serve on the nation's highest court. That happened on Friday, making a forceful debut from the bench and writing while showing signs of an independent streak. As anticipated, she was mostly aligned with the court's 2 other liberal judges, putting her on the losing side of high-profile contentious decisions involving affirmative action and college admissions, gay rights, and President Biden's student loan forgiveness program. But Ketanji Brown Jackson also demonstrated a willingness to part ways with her liberal colleagues, even when they were on the same side of an issue, to express her own vision of the law. She authored more solo dissenting opinions, that's 3, than any of the 3 most recent justices to join the court did as newbies. And the Supreme Court on Friday rejected a challenge to a constitutional amendment adopted by the state of Mississippi during the racist Jim Crow era, aimed at preventing Black people from voting. The justices left in place a law barring certain felons from voting, which the state says is no longer tainted by the racist intentions of its original authors because it has subsequently been updated on 2 occasions. A prominent group that represents LGBTQ conservatives says a video shared by Ron DeSantis' presidential campaign that slams Donald Trump for his past support of gay and transgender people ventured into homophobic territory. Now, according to this conservative group, the ad promotes headlines that DeSantis signed, quote, the most extreme slate of anti-trans laws in modern history and a draconian anti-trans bathroom bill, quote. The images are spliced together with footage of muscular, shirtless men and several Hollywood actors, including Brad Pitt, seen wearing a leather mask from the movie Troy. To wrap up Pride Month, according to the ad, let's hear from the politician who did more than any other Republican to celebrate it. This is a tweet from the campaign team of Ron DeSantis to Donald Trump. Well, a civil rights group is challenging legal admissions at Harvard University, saying the practice discriminates against students of color by giving an unfair boost to the mostly white children of alumni. The practice of giving priority to the children of alumni has faced growing pushback in the wake of last week's Supreme Court decision ending affirmative action in higher education. The NAACP added its weight behind the effort on Monday, asking more than 1,500 colleges and universities to even the playing field in admissions, including by ending legacy admissions. You are listening to Areva Martin in Real Time, and I'm your host, Areva Martin. This is your one-stop destination for today's trending news, expert analysis, and my unfiltered opinions. This is hour 2 of Areva Martin in Real Time, and this is the hour where we dig a little deeper. We go behind the headlines to talk about those issues that has everyone talking. And that issue today is the issue of race, systemic racism, and racial barriers. Now, the issue came up in, of course, this recent affirmative action decision. Many Black college admissions directors, Black students, Black-led organizations saying that the end of affirmative action in college admissions is going to set African Americans back. years, if not decades. We also are hearing the issue of a kind of affirmative action for white students in this new civil rights lawsuit that has been filed challenging legacy admissions in colleges. So we know right after George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery were murdered, we saw this rallying cry in cities and towns across the country, really forcing and demanding that the United States confront the racism of its past and present. Many folks call this America's racial reckoning. And this conversation, or these kinds of conversations about race and systemic racism, happened for what seemed to be at least a 6 to 12 month period. And it appeared that there was this intense need by some to address in a real way racism in this country. Some said this period was just the summer. They called it a summer of racial reckoning. Today, if you talk to many folks, particularly those that work in the DEI sector, those that work in college admissions, those that work in corporations, they'll tell you that whether you thought this racial reckoning conversation was happening over the course of an entire year, or you thought it was just the summer of racial reckoning, that essentially it's over. That many universities, many corporations, many institutions have gone back to where they were pre the murder of George Floyd, not wanting to even engage in conversations around race, calling you racist and divisive if you raise the issue of race, even if you try to have a conversation about race or systemic racism. So I thought we should take some time today to really explore what America's history with race is, and what do some of these recent Supreme Court cases tell us about where we are likely to go in terms of having any kind of deep and meaningful and substantial conversation about race. Why is it that just as we get what may seem to be pretty close to a breakthrough, to making progress on the issue of race, why do we have this kind of retrenchment happen? Like one step forward and 10 steps backwards. Why are so many folks in this country afraid to confront our racist past and present, and to take steps to really even the playing field, to take steps to really make the issue of equality something real and not just perceived by some? Going to have this conversation about race and systemic racism with Dr. Gerald Horne, who's a professor of history and African-American studies. He's an award-winning author of many, many books, over 24 books he's authored, and over 100 scholarly articles on the issue of race and racism. So I couldn't think of anyone more perfect to have this conversation about when we come forward right here on KBLA Talk 1580.
Follow the leader. KBLA Talk 1580. Follow the leader.
Be sure to follow us on Instagram at KBLA 1580.
Follow the leader.
Are you ready?
The station leading the way with exclusive interviews,
Follow the leader.
stimulating conversation, and intellectual discourse that empowers, enlightens, and informs.
Follow the leader.
Follow the leader at KBLA 1580.
We've got a lot to talk about.
Keep following the leader.
Follow the leader. Follow the leader. Follow the leader. Follow the leader. Follow the leader.
Gotta stay fresh, my house shot with a rest bar, shot with a rest bar, shot with a rest bar.
Have you visited us online for the grand opening of KBLA.store? For the best in new merch, gift ideas, books, media, and more, log on to KBLA.store. Be sure to check out our KBLA team favorites at KBLA.store today. That's KBLA.store for all the official merch on your favorite talk radio station, KBLA Talk 1580.
Bounce is back.
Here comes the brand new flavor in your head.
Race, social justice, sports, politics, art, music, culture. We do it all on the D.L. Hughley Afternoon Show. If you're not tuning in, then you are definitely missing out. It's the D.L. Hughley Afternoon Show, weekdays from 2 to 4 only on unapologetically progressive KBLA Talk 1580.
Like a brand new flavor in your head.
This is a rather bold prediction. pronouncement, but we think we can back it up. If you come across a radio frequency anywhere putting more variety and more diversity on the air than KBLA Talk 1580, we sure would like to hear about your discovery.
You got to have vision.
You can search, but we are confident that you won't find more shows covering more topics, hosted by a more diverse and inclusive lineup of talkers than the squad we have assembled here at KBLA Talk 1580.
This is the time, brothers. This is the time.
We've got something for everybody.
That's right.
Health and healing, history and humor, issues and events, empowerment and entertainment, all in one station.
What's really going on?
Free enterprise, you dig?
KBLA Talk 1580.
Yes.
Oh yeah. We got a lot to talk about.
King Kong ain't got on me.
If you're not listening to Tavis Smiley weekday mornings on KBLA Talk 1580, you're missing out. Everybody wants to talk to Tavis.
That's one reason, by the way, why I'm so thrilled to have this conversation with you today. The three people I always most hoped would interview me were Phil Donahue, Studs Terkel, and Tavis Smiley. Donahue's retired, Terkel's deceased, so this is a real thrill for me. And the reason why I have such respect for what you do is you have a historically informed conversation of depth and detail.
Be sure to tune in to Tavis Smiley weekday mornings, 9 a.m. to 12 noon on your unapologetically progressive radio station, KBLA Talk 1580. KBLA Talk 1580.
Is the pen mightier than the sword?
They say the pen is mightier than the...
You're listening to Areva Martin in real time. I'm your host, Areva Martin. And if you missed any part of today's show, any of the shows, you can check out the Areva Martin in real time podcast. And make sure you download the KBLA app because you can listen to all of the shows on the app. And you can watch the shows also on the KBLA YouTube station. So you can listen if you are in your car or on your smartphone, and you can also watch Areva Martin in real time on the KBLA YouTube station. And of course, you can follow me on all social platforms at Areva Martin to continue the conversations we are having on air. And today in the second hour, we're talking about this issue of race. We know that amid the national reckoning that we had on the issue of race following the murder of George Floyd, lots of folks were hopeful that this big conversation that we were having in so many different places and spaces in the country would lead to real policy changes, would lead to changes that would result in African Americans achieving what they believe to be, or what we believe to be, is equality. And that's equality in job opportunities, equality in economics, equality in healthcare, education. The list kind of goes on and on. But over the last year or so in particular, many folks are seeing a lot of the same companies and institutions that said they were committed to making positive changes, including policy changes, have been backing away from those commitments. I'm joined in this hour by Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a professor of history and African American studies at the University of Houston. He is one of the nation's leading authorities on the issue of race and racism. And I'm grateful to have you joining me, Dr. Horne, because this question keeps coming up every time you pick up the paper recently or turn to a particular story. There seems to be some conversation about race and how people perceive it. And we seem to be talking about race today very, very differently than how we were talking about it in the summer after George Floyd was murdered. So give us just a quick history on, what you have observed, just starting with George Floyd's murder. How it encouraged or hopeful were you that what we saw during that summer, this kind of racial reckoning period, were you encouraged at all that was going to lead to any really substantial policy changes?
Well, with regard to George Floyd, I think part of the protest was global. And whenever there's global pressure on the United States, whenever there's the spotlight from abroad on the United States, you tend to see movement, you tend to see action. And I think that's one of the lessons that has been lost by our movement. The second point that I would make is with regard to our talking within 24 hours of July 4th. That is to say, marking the national holiday of the birth of the United States of America. Your audience should recognize that of late, scholars, including myself, have come to the conclusion that the formation of the United States in 1776 was driven by the desire to preserve slavery, enslavement of Africans, because there was the perception that the colonial power, London, England, was moving towards abolition. And rather than subject themselves to that edict, the slave owners, led by George Washington, slave owner number one, decided to break the law set down by London and revolt and set up a new country. Given that rather unfortunate history, it's no accident that Black people have a perpetual uphill climb. And once again, that's a lesson that I'm not sure has been absorbed altogether.
Yeah, that's. Let me just stop you there. That is such a profound point, and I agree with you. Not one that is often made. Definitely not one that is highlighted in any history class that I've ever taken. And you said that scholars, including yourself, have come to this conclusion about why America was started to break away from Britain. That was in the process, you said, of ending slavery. What led you and other scholars to this conclusion?
Well, first of all, how can you be Black, melanin rich in the United States without wondering what is happening? Why are we being treated so atrociously? Second, all one has to do is look at the historical record. In 1772, England, in the Somerset's case, said that slavery was no longer the law in England itself. There was a real fear that this decision would leapfrog the Atlantic and jeopardize fortunes of enslaved Africans on this side of the Atlantic. And so the reality of our existence combined with the perusal of the historical record has led many scholars, including myself, to this conclusion.
And prior to you and other scholars reaching this conclusion, how has the breaking away from England been narrated? How has it been, told to us, taught to us from a historical standpoint?
Well, if you had your television on yesterday, you would have gotten an idea of how to respond to that question. That is to say that the formation of the United States of America was a great leap forward for humanity. Never before or since have we seen founders and framers who were as illustrious and as stellar as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson at all. I mean, you know the story. That's what's taught to our children today. That's what's been taught for decades. And because scholars like myself are beginning to push back, that's why you begin to see Governor DeSantis of Florida seeking to penalize teachers who veer from the accepted historical line. That's why you saw President Donald Trump in the waning days of his administration appointing a 1776 commission to reinforce the historical line of propaganda that is propagated relentlessly on the airwaves. So we know the story.
What is this position, the pushing back that you just described, that you and other scholars are doing about the reason our founding fathers broke away from England? Is this gaining traction? And what's the backlash? Because we know the backlash to the 1619 project. You just identified one piece of the backlash was the forming of Donald Trump of this 1776 commission to push back on the 1619 project. What kind of backlash? Well, so two questions. Is this theory about the country breaking away from England really being over the preservation of slavery? Is it getting traction at major universities across this country? And what's the pushback been like?
Well, I think it's gaining traction. I mean, my book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, the title is obviously appropriate for this discussion, is sold in the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, which is considered to be a kind of temple where those who revere the United States come to worship. You mentioned the 1619 project. Recall that in the original iteration of that laudable project, spearheaded by Nicole Hannah-Jones, now of Howard University, then the New York Times, she basically suggested what I just articulated. And that, of course, led to fierce counter-reaction, leading to the attempt to ban the 1619 Project, laws being passed in different states. And so what your audience should draw from this conversation is that history is not just about getting an accurate perception of what happened in the past. It also helps to shape what goes on today, and also helps to shape the future, and it also helps to shape the strategy and tactics that we pursue in pursuit of liberation.
Okay, so tell me about the pushback that your book and others who espouse your theory about the founding of the U.S. We saw, like you said, with the 1619 Project, this effort statewide by states like Florida to ban the project, and then exaggerating what the 1619 Project was even teaching to basically try to ban the teaching of any Black history. Is something similar happen with respect to your book?
Well, to a degree. I mean, what you have to realize is that what scholars discuss, oftentimes there's a gulf separating what scholars discuss from what's taught in K through 12, what's taught in the popular press, what's taught on television. I would say that with regard to my own work, it's gotten a respectful hearing amongst scholars, particularly amongst Black scholars.
Mm-hmm.
However, with regard to the non-scholarly community, needless to say, it's been excoriated, it's been attacked, but that's par for the course, because what we're talking about is a creation myth. We're talking about a creation myth that has lasted for centuries. And so obviously, if you begin to challenge that, you should expect to be attacked.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that you say that. I was looking at some of the social media posts yesterday about the 4th of July, and some white folks that I follow on Twitter, they would start, and these were progressives, they consider themselves progressives, liberals. They would say, well, despite the flaws in the founding fathers, or despite some of the problems, we still live in a great country. And I just thought it was kind of comical that they were trying to be PC, politically correct, by acknowledging that everything we've been taught about the founding fathers and our origin story, they're smart enough to know that a lot of it is propaganda and not true, but they still don't want to in any way appear to be bashing or criticizing or somehow rejecting that origin story, because it has been ingrained into all of us. We've been indoctrinated with these myths about our founding fathers. Do you see there being ever a moment in history where we walk away from that, where we're just willing to accept that they were men and they did things that were in their economic best interest, even if they weren't in the best interest of African-American people?
Well, it's happening as we speak, not only with regard to Black history, but I think a powerful impulse for an alteration of this creation myth has been the advances we've made in Native American studies, because it's difficult even for the staunchest and most stalwart U.S. patriot to rationalize and justify what befell the indigenous population. They once controlled this land centuries ago, and they were subjected to genocide. And even the coarsest thinker, I believe, I hope, finds it difficult to justify and rationalize genocide. And that's what happens with regard to history, at least ideally. That is to say that new sources are uncovered, new perspectives develop as times change, and this leads to an alteration of the basic historical understanding, and that's what's happening today, and that's what's led to the 1776 Commission. That's what's propelling Governor DeSantis of Florida. That's what helped to elect Governor Youngkin of Virginia, who ran on a platform explicitly challenging what he called critical race theory, which can be interpreted as his displeasure with newer interpretations of the founding of the United States. And he, hailing from Virginia, which used to be the citadel of enslavement, I find it ironic that that's the platform he chose to stand on.
What do you make today, Professor Horne? So I started the show by talking about this so-called racial reckoning, these conversations we were having after George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. You know, we can name that cluster of African-American men and women who were killed, you know, just as the pandemic was hitting. And it seemed like because of that worldwide protest that you identified, there was this intense desire on the parts of some folks, at least to learn more about Black history, to have conversations, tough conversations about systemic racism. You know, for many folks that never even heard that term, they weren't even familiar with the concept of systemic racism, didn't know what it meant. So folks were buying up Black books. They were, you know, trying to have these, let's call it woke, for lack of a better term, woke conversations. And now I saw an article, 6 of the largest studios, TV network studios, eliminated DEI positions, other corporations eliminating DEI positions, and companies now really stepping back from some of the commitments that they made to support social justice organizations and to support the work of anti-Blackness and anti-racist policies that existed in their own workplaces. When we come forward, I want to get your take on this moment of history that we find ourselves in, and was it predictable? And was this racial reckoning really ever a racial reckoning? Stay with us. KBLA Talk 1580.
Access granted.
In a survey conducted by the public opinion research firm Eviderus, KBLA Talk 1580 consistently emerged as the station of choice for Black audiences in the Los Angeles media market and beyond. The survey also revealed that the vast majority of Black audiences are concerned about the lack of Black-owned media and are more likely to listen to talk radio that focuses on issues that impact the Black community. For some reason, the other talk stations haven't quite figured that out.
If you think about KFI, well, KFI only has like a 3% Black listenership. 3%. So there's a good 97% out there to support a station like KBLA.
At KBLA Talk 1580, we've got your Black. Your Black. Your Black.
Follow the leader.
KBLA Talk 1580.
Follow the leader.
Be sure to follow us on Instagram at KBLA 1580.
Follow the leader.
Are you ready?
The station leading the way with exclusive interviews,
Follow the leader.
stimulating conversation, and intellectual discourse that empowers, enlightens, and informs.
Follow the leader.
Follow the leader at KBLA 1580. We've got a lot to talk about.
Keep following the leader.
Follow the leader. Follow the leader. Follow the leader. Follow the leader. Follow the leader.
Gotta stay fresh, my house shot with a rest bar, shot with a rest bar, shot with a rest bar.
Have you visited us online for the grand opening of KBLA.store? For the best in new merch, gift ideas, books, media, and more, log on to KBLA.store. Be sure to check out our KBLA team favorites at KBLA.store today. That's KBLA.store for all the official merch on your favorite talk radio station, KBLA Talk 1580.
Bounce is back.
Here comes the brand new flavor in your head.
Race, social justice, sports, politics, art, music, culture. We do it all on the D.L. Hughley Afternoon Show. If you're not tuning in, then you are definitely missing out. It's the D.L. Hughley Afternoon Show, weekdays from 2 to 4, only on unapologetically progressive KBLA Talk 1580.
Like a brand new flavor in your head. Yeah.
This is a rather bold pronouncement, but we think we can back it up.
Better believe it, brother.
If you come across a radio frequency anywhere putting more variety and more diversity on the air than KBLA Talk 1580, we sure would like to hear about your discovery.
You got to have vision.
You can search, but we are confident that you won't find more shows covering more topics, hosted by a more diverse and inclusive lineup of talkers than the squad we have assembled here at KBLA Talk 1580.
This is the time, brothers. This is the time.
We've got something for everybody.
That's right.
Health and healing, history and humor, issues and events, empowerment and entertainment, all in one station.
What's really going on?
Free enterprise, you dig?
KBLA Talk 1580.
Yes.
Oh yeah. We got a lot to talk about.
King Kong ain't got on me.
If you're not listening to Tavis Smiley weekday mornings on KBLA Talk 1580, you're missing out. Everybody wants to talk to Tavis.
That's one reason, by the way, why I'm so thrilled to have this conversation with you today. The three people I always most hoped would interview me were Phil Donahue, Studs Terkel, and Tavis Smiley. Donahue's retired, Terkel's deceased, so this is a real thrill for me. And the reason why I have such respect for what you do is you have a historically informed conversation of depth and detail.
Be sure to tune in to Tavis Smiley weekday mornings, 9 a.m. to 12 noon on your unapologetically progressive radio station, KBLA Talk 1580. KBLA Talk 1580.
Is the pen mightier than the sword?
They say the pen is mightier than the sword. At KBLA Talk 1580, we not only have a lot to talk about, we have a lot to write about. Politics, relationships, business, empowerment, and culture. The all-star roster at KBLA Talk 1580 has you covered.
That's what it's all about.
Be sure to follow us on all our socials for our latest book releases, op-eds, essays, and commentaries from our hosts. And, of course, download the KBLA 1580 app as we strive to remain your most trusted, credible, and reliable source for the issues you care about. This is unapologetically progressive. KBLA Talk 1580.
What up, baby?
I'm young, gifted, and black.
At KBLA Talk 1580, we do more than just talk.
Hey there, I'm Jared Hill, president of the National Association of Black Journalists of Los Angeles, and I just want to say thank you for the benevolent $10,000 donation and scholarships for the next generation of black journalists.
And I'm Haywood Galbraith, photojournalist and founder of the Minority Photojournalism Institute. Thanks, KBLA, for your generous $10,000 scholarship gift to help us train the next generation of black photojournalists.
Congratulations to all the students who will benefit from the scholarship dollars raised at our Black History Month luncheon, honoring black legends in LA media. When we come forward at KBLA Talk 1580, we're bringing everybody with us. Everybody with us. Everybody with us. Everybody with us.
Connection established. Access granted.
In a survey conducted by the public opinion research firm Eviderus, KBLA Talk 1580 consistently emerged as the station of choice for black audiences in the Los Angeles media market and beyond. The survey also revealed that the vast majority of black audiences are concerned about the lack of black-owned media and are more likely to listen to talk radio that focuses on issues that impact the black community. For some reason, the other talk stations haven't quite figured that out.
If you think about KFI, well, KFI only has like a 3% black listenership. 3%. So there's a good 97% out there to support a station like KB.
I'm back, and you're listening to Areva Martin in real time, and I'm your host, Areva Martin. And in this hour, we are talking to Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a professor of history and African American studies at the University of Houston. He is the author of more than 30 books and 100 scholarly articles on the issue of race and racism and America's history with race. We were talking about where we are today versus where we were in the summer of protest after the murder of George Floyd. So, Professor, there was a lot of talk about this racial reckoning. Help us understand what was happening in terms of the racial reckoning. Was it real? And where are we today in terms of that reckoning?
Well, to repeat, I think that what happened is that there was global protest. The global spotlight was on the United States of America. And when that happens, you tend to see movement. Recall that when Jim Crow began to crumble 6 or 7 decades ago, it was precisely because Jim Crow, U.S. apartheid, was in the global spotlight. That is to say that as African and Caribbean nations were coming to independence at a time of U.S. contestation with the then socialist camp, tremendous pressure was placed on the United States to ease the atrocious treatment of Black people so that friends could be won in Africa, resource-rich Africa, and the Caribbean. But now, of course, the socialist camp has collapsed. We're in the midst of a counter-revolutionary period, as symbolized by that Supreme Court decision that you mentioned on affirmative action at the top. This should not be a shock or surprise. It should only shock or surprise the naive or those who don't understand history, because we recognize that because of the strength of the right wing in this country, whenever we're able to make advances, inevitably there's a backlash, inevitably there's a counter-revolutionary impulse, and that's what we're suffering and enduring at this precise moment.
So how would you describe that progress? So you said the summer protests, we had worldwide protests. The spotlight was on the U.S. because of these horrific police killings of unarmed Black men in particular. What progress would you say was made then? And now, how is that progress being stripped away?
Well, I think that there were tentative steps towards having more focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion at the workplace. But as your comments suggested, you see those officers who are administering DEI resigning in droves or being pushed out in droves, precisely because we're in the midst of a counter-revolutionary moment. We're facing the prospect, perhaps, of having Agent Orange himself, Donald J. Trump, returning to the White House in January 2025. That is to say, if he's not in prison, and even if he is in prison, he could still administer the country from a jail cell. That's the absurdity to which we've sunk.
Yeah. So those of you that study history, obviously, like you said, you're naive if you did not expect to see this coming. Did you expect to see this racial reckoning period end? And I'm going to say end, and we can argue about whether it has ended officially or if it's just waning. But did you expect to see the stepping back happens, what I'm going to say, so quickly?
Well, let's say that I was not shocked nor surprised. And I think it has to do with the lineup of political forces. You have a very powerful right wing that basically has the operative slogan of no antagonists, no enemies to our right. Therefore, you see Donald J. Trump rationalizing a warlike assault on the Congress in January 6, 2021, in order to prevent the peaceful transfer of power. Although supposedly those supporters of Mr. Trump are stalwart supporters of law and order. However, many of our friends on the left, some of whom you alluded to with regard to social media, they have an operative slogan of no allies to our left. That is, a person like myself, they would tend to try to ignore. And of course, the kinds of opinions that I'm expressing here are not just my own. They represent opinions of many. I would hope to think thousands of others. And as long as that kind of dialectic exists, where the right is willing to cooperate with any to their right, and the left is unwilling to have allies with any to their left, we're always going to be in trouble.
So, where do we go from here? Because as we both have said, folks are leaving these companies. DEI officers are either leaving voluntarily because they're frustrated because they didn't see progress made. They didn't have power that they thought they would have. They didn't see an investment being made by many of these corporations. They didn't see a true commitment to diversity. Many of them believed that they were just window dressing, that, their positions were window dressing. Some of the companies got rid of them. And we have a Supreme Court saying we don't need to worry about race because we're past that. The issues that some of the civil rights laws were enacted to address in terms of racism no longer exist. That's essentially what our the 6-3 conservative court is saying, is that we don't need protections against racism because we're in a post-racial society. We heard a lot of that after Barack Obama was elected the first Black president. We know it was ridiculous then as it is now, but many people believe that. Is this surprising to you, or is this again a part of what you've seen throughout history?
No, it's not a shock, nor is it a surprise to me. However, with regard to how we try to turn the situation around, I think history offers lessons. I've already alluded to the point that we've made progress when we're able to internationalize our struggle. That's what's missing today. You've seen that intermittently. For example, the parents of slain Ferguson, Missouri teenager Michael Brown took their case to the United Nations in Geneva. What we need, of course, is our civil rights organizations to walk in their footsteps. So what we need is our civil rights organizations to try to internationalize the struggle and to move beyond the halls of Congress. Until that begins to happen, I dare say that we're perpetually going to be encountering difficulties. And certainly, the second point that I would make is that we need more organizing. We need more organizing amongst tenants who are facing an absence of rent control and are facing skyrocketing rents and gentrification. We need more organizing by students who are now about not only to suffer the ravages of eradicating affirmative action, but of course, the Supreme Court also said that student loan forgiveness was also unconstitutional. We need more organizing in the workplace. And I think Los Angeles, to a certain degree, presents a model that we can emulate. I've noted that your hotel workers, for example, are out on strike for higher wages and better working conditions. We need more of that kind of street heat.
What was the concept? You mentioned California. You're right. Hotel workers were, and I believe are still on strike in California around wages, not being able to, make a living wage in a state, in a city where the cost of living is so high. California also just released its report on reparations, a 1,000-page report with over 100 recommendations on how the state can address racially motivated policies that have impacted Blacks in the state in terms of everything from healthcare to the criminal justice system. So if we are in this moment where, Donald Trump and those that support Donald Trump, the Supreme Court saying we are in a post-racial society, then there would be no place for reparations, is there?
Well, that's what we have to change. And speaking of the international situation, I should also mention what's going on in France right now. France, of course, has pioneered in this idea of having a so-called colorblind society, up to and including failing to collect statistics with regard to race and racism, for example, who are most likely to be targeted by the police. And you see the result. You see the results of unrest. Why aren't our leaders and organizations reaching across the Atlantic in order to give momentum to the anti-racist struggle by internationalizing the anti-racist struggle? And certainly these recommendations with regard to reparations, it's a breath of fresh air. It's a step forward, but it has to be actualized at the Assembly and the State Senate in Sacramento, and that's going to be a battle royal. And unless we're sufficiently organized, I dare say that this reparations report will gather dust on a library shelf.
When we come forward, I love this notion of internationalizing the struggle, finding allies even outside of the U.S. But I do worry about what damage this 6-3 court can do, what damage some of these supermajority Republican legislatures can do, and how we combat that beyond this sense of forming allyship with the international community. Stay with us, KBLA Talk 1580.
Gotta stay fresh, my house shot with a red spot,
Have you visited us online for the grand opening of KBLA.store? For the best in new merch, gift ideas, books, media, and more, log on to KBLA.store. Be sure to check out our KBLA team favorites at KBLA.store today. That's KBLA.store for all the official merch on your favorite talk radio station, KBLA Talk 1580.
The bounce is back.
Here comes the brand new flavor in your head.
Race, social justice, sports, politics, art, music, culture. We do it all on the D.L. Hughley Afternoon Show. If you're not tuning in, then you are definitely missing out. It's the D.L. Hughley Afternoon Show, weekdays from 2 to 4 only on unapologetically progressive KBLA Talk 1580.
Like a brand new flavor in your head.
This is a rather bold pronouncement, but we think we can back it up. If you come across a radio frequency anywhere putting more variety and more diversity on the air than KBLA Talk 1580, we sure would like to hear about your discovery.
You got to have vision.
You can search, but we are confident that you won't find more shows covering more topics, hosted by a more diverse and inclusive lineup of talkers than the squad we have assembled here at KBLA Talk 1580.
This is the time, brothers. This is the time.
We've got something for everybody.
That's right.
Health and healing, history and humor, issues and events, empowerment and entertainment, all in one station.
What's really going on?
Free enterprise, you dig?
KBLA Talk 1580.
Yes.
Oh yeah. We got a lot to talk about.
King Kong ain't got on me.
If you're not listening to Tavis Smiley weekday mornings on KBLA Talk 1580, you're missing out. Everybody wants to talk to Tavis.
That's one reason, by the way, why I'm so thrilled to have this conversation with you today. The three people I always most hoped would interview me were Phil Donahue, Studs Terkel, and Tavis Smiley. Donahue's retired, Terkel's deceased, so this is a real thrill for me. And the reason why I have such respect for what you do is you have a historically informed conversation of depth and detail.
Be sure to tune in to Tavis Smiley weekday mornings, 9 a.m. to 12 noon on your unapologetically progressive radio station, KBLA Talk 1580. KBLA Talk 1580.
Is the pen mightier than the sword?
They say the pen is mightier than the sword. At KBLA Talk 1580, we not only have a lot to talk about, we have a lot to write about. Politics, relationships, business, empowerment, and culture. The all-star roster at KBLA Talk 1580 has you covered.
That's what it's all about.
Be sure to follow us on all our socials for our latest book releases, op-eds, essays, and commentaries from our hosts. And, of course, download the KBLA 1580 app as we strive to remain your most trusted, credible, and reliable source for the issues you care about. This is unapologetically progressive. KBLA Talk.
To Areva Martin in real time. I'm your host, Areva Martin, and we're talking about this thorny issue of race, systemic racism in this country, where we've been in this country as it relates to race and where we are going. Talking with Dr. Gerald Horne, an esteemed and distinguished professor of history at the University of Houston, and considered one of the nation's leading authorities on race. So, Professor Horne, some folks are saying, look, Democrats, we need to expand and unstack the Supreme Court, because with this 6-3 conservative court, no matter what a Democratic or progressive legislature does, it's going to be challenged by some conservative group. It's going to make its way to this Supreme Court. And for at least the next decade, if not longer, given the ages of our justices, they are going to find ways to rule that in favor of the conservative right. And they see the country as it was in the 1950s rather than the way it is in the current moment or in 2050. What do you say to that? That unpacking and expanding the court is another way that we have to address what's happening in this country in terms of race?
Well, sure, it's a worthwhile maneuver, but let's get down to brass tacks. That is to say, Mr. Biden is not able to change the Supreme Court through executive order. That is to say, by a stroke of a pen. I assume there has to be legislation introduced into Congress. Once you talk about that, you run up against Senator Manchin of West Virginia, a Democrat, Senator Sinema of Arizona, a Democrat. The Democrats only have, as I understand it, a 51-49 majority. And if you take away those two, well, then you'll see that that notion of reframing and remaking the Supreme Court is going to have an uphill climb, which once again brings us back to trying to change the political climate, change the political atmosphere through organizing on the ground and through internationalizing our struggle. That has been the historic way we have had profound change in the United States of America, going back to the abolition of slavery, a direct result of the strategies I've just suggested, not to mention the retreat of Jim Crow, the process of which I enumerated just a few moments ago.
But I guess my point is, even if you do that, if you do organize, if workers, if poor folks in Kentucky start to realize that their issues are much more aligned with Black and brown folks than not, and you have that kind of organizing taking place in the country as well as with allies outside the country, if everything is going to make its way eventually to the Supreme Court, whether it's gay rights, whether it's women's rights to the reproductive freedom, whether it's issues of race and college admissions, you still got a problem.
Well, sure. You faced the same problem in the 1930s when you once again had a right-wing Supreme Court. President Roosevelt came up with the idea of expanding the Supreme Court. The conservatives got the message and decided to change their tune. That's why I think it's worthwhile, and I did not throw cold water on the idea of trying to reframe and remake the Supreme Court up to and including expanding its numbers, because then that could cause the conservative majority to rethink. And that's why we have to say that we can't not necessarily dismiss any particular maneuver or strategy. That's been the problem up to this point, which is why we're in such a deep hole, that we basically ruled out, for example, internationalizing the struggle and have concentrated disproportionately on Washington, D.C. And now, of course, we find ourselves staring to the barrel of a gun.
And you've worked obviously with lots of organizations throughout your work as a professor, as a scholar, as a historian. Why do you think, if internationalizing the fight has been one of the most effective tools in fighting back some of this anti-racism, why isn't it happening? Why hasn't it happened of late?
Well, I think that there's a certain short-sightedness on the part of our leadership, a certain ignorance of basic historical lessons, because we recognize that once you start moving in an effective manner, you're subject to being indicted, you're subject to having a tax investigation of your finances. And I think that you should not ignore the other issue that I mentioned, which is organizing, because you cannot begin to talk about internationalizing the struggle unless you're organized, unless workers are organized, students are organized, tenants are organized, et cetera.
But we've seen organizing in this country. The greatest example of that was after George Floyd's murder. We saw groups, all ages, all races, all socioeconomic class, and much of that organizing happened via social media, text messages, social media posts on Facebook and Instagram. So we've seen organizing.
Well, I don't think so. I mean, the United States has the lowest percentage of workers in unions than any other advanced industrialized country. I mean, outside of government, speaking of the post office and workers at City Hall and at the federal center in Washington, D.C., less than 10% of workers are organized in this country. That means
but so let's define what you mean by organized. You mean union?
Organized? Of course.
Okay, well, no, I thought you meant grassroots organizing. You mean you?
Well, if you look at the anti-Jim Crow movement, how did Dr. King, how was he able to fly around the country? To a certain extent, he was subsidized by unions, the Hospital Workers Union in New York City.
But again, that's we've seen union busting. We've seen again these super majorities in Republican red states doing everything they can to prevent workers from unionizing, to weaken the power. And we've seen again the actions about organizing, union organizing, those laws, those legislations, pieces of legislation around union organizing make their way back to the Supreme Court. Again, I don't want to beat that horse because it's dead, but the point is that everything you do in this country, the Republicans have been working on this. They've had a 50-year strategy starting back, with the founding of the Federalist Society to identify, cultivate, nurture, propel conservatives whose sole goal was to be appointed to federal courts. And they have been effective in effectuating this decades-long plan to stack the courts, lower courts as well as the Supreme Court, with these conservative judges to make it almost impossible. Even when you have a Democratic president, Democratic Senate, Democratic Congress, even if we have all three branches of government controlled by Democrats, and I don't mean Democrats in name only, I mean progressive and, more moderate Democrats who are willing to vote for things like, expanding voting rights, expanding the opportunities for students to get debt relief, protecting the rights of women in terms of abortion, that even if all that happens, if those decisions get challenged, which they will, by this very well-oiled conservative machine that's out there, and all these cases end up at the Supreme Court, we're right back where we started from.
Well, I'm sure you realize that this is not the first conservative Supreme Court in the history of the United States. After all, there was the Dred Scott decision of 1857, where the High Court said that the whites were not bound to respect any rights of Black people, and Black people could never be citizens of the United States of America. That was overturned. I referenced the New Deal of the 1930s, when you had attempts to block legislation like Social Security and unemployment compensation. That was reversed as well. But it
no doubt we've had conservative Supreme Courts, no doubt about it, throughout the history of America. But this court in particular, given the ages of the individuals, given the makeup of it, this court could set us back in the way the Dred Scott decision did decades if it does not, if something doesn't change.
Well, that's true. And so what is to be done? I've laid out a program. What's your program?
I don't disagree with you. I don't think it's either or. Obviously, this is a multifaceted strategy because this is a very complex case. This is a complex set of issues. And I think, I agree with you. We've gotten ourselves in a hole. And when you are in a hole, it's very difficult to dig out of. Democrats will sleep at the switch on the issue of the courts. We haven't taken full advantage of our opportunities when we had those opportunities to execute the kind of a strategy that Republicans have been planning and actualizing over the last, as I said, 50 years or more. We are out of time, Professor Horne. Such an important and stimulating conversation. I'm always smarter when I talk with you. Got to have you back. Got to continue this conversation about race and where we go in this country. Thank you again so much for joining me. Again, make sure you download the KBLA app and listen to all of the KBLA shows. Follow me on social media at Areva Martin. The next voice that you hear will be Robin Ayers and the Raw Report right here on KBLA Talk 1580.
Access granted.
In a survey conducted by the public opinion research firm Eviderus, KBLA Talk 1580 consistently emerged as the station of choice for Black audiences in the Los Angeles media market and beyond. The survey also revealed that the vast majority of Black audiences are concerned about the lack of Black-owned media and are more likely to listen to talk radio that focuses on issues that impact the Black community. For some reason, the other talk stations haven't quite figured that out.
If you think about KFI, well, KFI only has like a 3% Black listenership. 3%. So there's a good 97% out there to support a station like KBLA.
At KBLA Talk 1580, we've got your Black. Your Black. Your Black.
Follow the leader.
KBLA Talk 1580.
Follow the leader.
Be sure to follow us on Instagram at KBLA 1580.
Follow the leader.
Are you ready?
The station leading the way with exclusive interviews,
Follow the leader.
stimulating conversation, and intellectual discourse that empowers, enlightens, and informs.
Follow the leader.
Follow the leader at KBLA 1580.
We've got a lot to talk about.
Keep following the leader.
Follow the leader. Follow the leader. Follow the leader. Follow the leader. Follow the leader.
Gotta stay fresh, my house shot with a rest bar, shot with a rest bar, shot with a rest bar.
Have you visited us online for the grand opening of KBLA.store? For the best in new merch, gift ideas, books, media, and more, log on to KBLA.store. Be sure to check out our KBLA team favorites at KBLA.store today. That's KBLA.store for all the official merch on your favorite talk radio station, KBLA Talk 1580.
The bounce is back.
Here comes the brand new flavor in your head.
Race, social justice, sports, politics, art, music, culture. We do it all on